Okay, so now let's talk about the subsequent recession. That's kind of the timeline of the financial crisis if it's not the nuts and bolts of everything that went on during the crisis, which in and of itself would be a semester's worth of classes. So let's talk about the recession, but let's do it in a comparative sense. First, I want to compare it with recessions that we ourselves have lived through, and then I will, after that, compare it with the Great Depression. So here I've plotted some data on GDP, gross domestic product, which is the broadest measure of goods and services produced by the American economy. Just adding everything up, from haircuts to automobiles to jet aircraft, in dollars terms, you get GDP, the nation's output. During a recession, if you think of GDP as like a balloon, GDP shrinks, air is let out of the balloon, and GDP shrinks. We're producing less today than we did yesterday. During normal times, our economy is expanding, and that balloon is continually expanding. During a recession, it's shrinking. Now, how much does it shrink? Well, during a typical recession, and what I've done here is plot the average post-war recessions up through the recession that began in 1990. That's the yellow line. And so during the typical recession, if we start the recession, and we just set the value of GDP equal to 100 at the beginning of the recession, GDP usually drops 2 or 3 percentage points. So if we were producing 100 last year, this year we're producing 97. Okay, so about a 3% decline in GDP before the economy starts to right itself and the recovery begins. And usually within about 5 quarters after the beginning of the recession, we're out of it. We've cleared, and now we're back to producing, and the economy is expanding, and our balloon is expanding. We're producing more than we did not only during the recession, but before the recession began. So that's the typical pattern of post-war recessions. Now, we've had 2 recessions before the most recent one. There was a recession in 2001. That's the red line. That was a very minor recession, as it turns out. GDP in the original data shrank a quarter or 2, but then it expanded. Since the data have been revised, it turns out there was actually no decline in GDP except maybe 1 quarter here. It never actually got below where it had been. But growth was relatively slow after that recession. So it was a minor recession, but a rather slow recovery. We had a somewhat more serious recession in 1990-91. If you remember, there was an oil shock associated with the first Gulf War, and that resulted in something of a recession. That is the green line here. Output shrank about 2%, but as was typically the case, after about 5 quarters, we were back to where we were in terms of GDP at the start of the recession. And then growth took off. Again, not at the average rate, a little bit slower than average, but not too far off the typical pattern. Well, the blue line here is the most recent recession, the recession that began in the 4th quarter of 2007. It didn't start off too badly. You know, the first 6 months or so of 2008 were not too bad. But after September of 2008, when we had the Lehman failure and the AIG collapse and the Fannie Freddie collapse, and that's when things really got bad, not only for the financial system, but for the economy more broadly. And the economy really continued to sink. So even at 5 quarters, we were still in the trough here. So this was 5, 6 quarters after the beginning of the recession was before we hit bottom. And we had lost, at that time, our economy was, GDP was about 95% of what it had been at the start of the recession. So whereas the typical recession loses maybe 2 percentage points off of GDP, this time we lost 5, which is severe by post-war standards. There have only been 1 or 2 that are close to that in the post-war period. And then the recovery has been agonizingly slow. And it's actually kind of slowed down of late. Here we are now some 14, 15 quarters after the start of the recession in 2007, and our GDP is only now approaching the level it was in the 4th quarter of 2007. So we've had an unusually slow recovery. We see that in terms of output. We also see that in terms of employment. The typical pattern, again, is marked by the yellow line here. During a recession, we typically lose about 2% of jobs in the economy. So again, I've set total employment equal to an index number of 100 at the start of the recession, as we go through the recession, about 12 months after the beginning of the recession, the typical recession, we're at the bottom, where we have employment about 98% of where it had been at the start of the recession. And then we get a recovery. And within 24 months after the start of the recession, our economy is now producing more jobs than we had even before the recession began. Now, the last two recessions, the 1991 and 2001 recessions, we lost about the typical number of jobs, but we had very slow recoveries. They were referred to as jobless recoveries, because even though GDP was expanding, employment was not, or not very fast. So, for example, after the 2001 recession, we were still more than 24 months past the start of the recession, and employment was below where it was at the beginning of the recession. It took almost 48 months before total employment in the United States was back to where it had been at the start of the recession. So that was a long time to get employment back up. Well, the blue, again, is what we're experiencing now. We lost a lot more jobs during the recession. About 6% of jobs were lost as compared to 2 in the typical case, and we've gained very few of those jobs back, which explains why the unemployment rate is 9.1% today as compared to 5% when we entered the recession. So the economy's slowly been expanding. Job growth has been growing a little bit, but it's painfully slow. And one of the big areas of losses, unfortunately, has been in the ranks of our school districts and our state and local governments. There, obviously been a lot of layoffs there, also, but not just in the public sector. A lot of private sector jobs have been lost as well, and have yet to come back. So that's a characteristic of the most recent recession. Okay, so we've given that some context in terms of experiences that we're somewhat familiar with. Now let's go back and look at the context of the Great Depression. First table here are just comparing, again, GDP, length of the recession, the unemployment rate during the recession. I've also included the consumer price index here, the inflation rate, for some comparisons. During the recession of 2007 to 9, that recession lasted 18 months. We're still in recovery mode. We lost somewhat over more than 5% of GDP. The unemployment rate at its peak was 10.1%. It's still 9.1%. And we've had small growth in the consumer price index. Prices have continued to rise on average in the economy at about a 1.5% rate. Now let's contrast that with the Great Depression. That contraction phase lasted almost 4 years, from the peak in the summer of 1929 to the trough in the first quarter of 1933. Nearly 4 years of collapsing economy. GDP fell by 36%. In other words, your balloon, think of it as a circumference of 100, is now shrunk down to a circumference of about 65. It's a tremendous lost output in the U.S. economy before the economy started turning around. The unemployment rate, our peak in this most recent recession, 10%, unusually high. We've had only one other recession since World War II where the unemployment rate got above 10%, and that was in the early 80s. In the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was above 10% for an entire decade, the entire decade of the 30s. The unemployment rate maxed out in 1933 at 25%. My research assistant got a little bit too precise. I don't know where he came up with the 0.36 there. Just remember the 25%. And, and of course, that doesn't capture the whole story either. So many people were employed as part-time or in jobs that, were kind of underemploying their skills. I had my two grandfathers. One of them lost his job entirely during the Great Depression. The other one, who had been a manager of a gas plant, a plant that takes natural gas and makes it ready for use as fuel in West Virginia, he had run the entire organization. Well, he was the only one left operating that plant. He was just kept on as a night watchman. So he did a little farming on the side and worked part-time as a night watchman, even though he had been the plant manager. Everyone else got laid off. So, he was still employed. He was not part of the 25%, but clearly it was not the job that he had been trained for or wanted. So he was underemployed at that point. So there was a lot of that going on as well. We also had massive deflation. That is, the price level was shrinking. Not just prices of individual goods, but prices of all goods were going down.